Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. My guest today, something of a regular here, Margaret Kimberley, the senior editor of Black Agenda Report. And Margaret is the author of a new book, Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. And so I asked her to come and talk with us about the book and about what it tells us about our current political situation. So welcome back to Wider View, Margaret.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be back.
Well, first of all, I guess my first question on this is what led you to take on writing about this history, and why did you take the rather unusual step of viewing the history of Black America by talking about each president?
Well, it all began when I wrote a Black Agenda Report column about Theodore Roosevelt. I had watched one of those public television documentaries about the Roosevelts, and they always, elevate the subject matter. Mm-hmm. And I was very unhappy because I know that he was a personally racist man. He was a very proud imperialist. He was open white supremacist. And I wrote a column about that, and a friend and supporter of Black Agenda Report suggested to me, said, why don't you write about all the presidents? Why don't you write a book? It was something I had not done before. And I thought about it, and I realized that it was a great way to tell American history, to tell Black history, to inform people on, sometimes Black history, and this Black History Month is segmented as if it's distinct and separate, but the history of our presence in this country tells us many things. For example, why was a new capital built, a new city when there were already cities? Why was a new city built and built in a swamp between Maryland and Virginia? And the answer is the Virginians, people like Washington, Madison, and Jefferson, needed to have a capital that was safely away from any abolitionist activity. They needed to have a capital that was safely within the bounds of the plantation economy. Right. So that is an example of something that, we're not taught. It is true that Alexander Hamilton, there was a deal, and the new government would assume war debts, and there would the money capital, the Federal Reserve, would be in New York, and the governmental capital would be somewhere else. Mm-hmm. That is true, but they built a new city and located it where they did in order to protect slavery, and that's a kind of thing that people should know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we also skim over in most of our histories the number of, compromises is hardly the word to use, but the number of ways that slavery was built into the Constitution, that it was assumed and protected.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person in order to count them for purposes of representation, while simultaneously conceding you could not have an enslaved person and then consider them a full human being. That there was a Fugitive Slave Act in the original Constitution. The Electoral College was intended to give more representation to states like Virginia. So yes, from the very beginning, the Constitution, the formation of this country, defended chattel slavery. So that explains a lot of what happens in our present. You can't have a group of people who were owned, who were kept under physical control, and then have their status change in society without some real revolutionary change. Those people will always be on the bottom. And I think looking at that history, looking at the founding of the country, explains the present as well.
Yeah, it does. Well, one thing that stood out to me in reading this book, several things stood out actually, but one of the things that stood out was the fact that racism was part of the political scene in the country from the founding, it didn't, and that while one party was always seen as maybe less horrible for black people than the other, the differences weren't really there. You know,
Yeah. Well,
both.
yeah, we have this duopoly, and over time the parties have changed, and there aren't Whigs anymore, and there were, Democrat Republicans, and the Republicans were began as an effort to stop the spread of slavery. But there's always one party that functions as the white people's party, because another party is seen as being even somewhat protective of black people and meeting our interests.
Right.
So for most of history after the Civil War, it was the Republicans who were the party of Lincoln. And the Democrats were the party of the segregated South. So Frederick Douglass famously said in the late 1800s, the Republican Party is the ship and all else is the sea. And we now it's flipped in the last 50 years, and it's the Democrats who are seen as the ship, in this stormy sea, who can, if not protect us, at least keep the pro-white party, the Republicans now, keep them at bay. And that explains a lot of political activity, or sometimes lack of political activity. We see it now playing out in the current presidential election, especially with Donald Trump being in the White House, that the goal of black people is to see him leave, to see him get out. And this is unfortunate that our politics has been diminished to this level, because all we are told by people who are not disinterested is that a particular person is the most electable. So we're told for months Joe Biden is the most electable, and all these polls showed he had support among black people. And that's because many people were told over and over and over again he was the one who could beat Trump. That, of course, will change if he continues to do poorly in caucuses and primaries. We want somebody who will beat Trump. So we will then perhaps turn to someone else. And this has caused us to support people who we either should not have supported or made demands on them before supporting them. Jimmy Carter, during his campaign, he spoke of ethnic purity and he was against busing. And Bill Clinton did some disgraceful things. He executed a mentally disabled black man during his 1992 campaign.
Right.
The Sister Souljah moment to embarrass Jesse Jackson. But black people, and myself included, I always have to admit that I voted for him, felt that, the Republicans are always so much worse. We have to accept anything that Democrats do and support them.
And it's actually, in fact, there was an opinion piece in the New York Times this morning to the effect that none of the Democrats that are running for the nomination have a strong following in the black community, and that, in fact, some of them have tremendous negatives, for African American voters.
Sure. Mike Bloomberg has entered the race late. Former mayor of New York City. I live in New York, and he had a terrible record. We thought that Rudy Giuliani, a Republican, and he was a racist person. He was the worst mayor we could possibly have had. But then he was followed by Bloomberg, who was a Democrat most of his life and then became a Republican. So people, didn't fear him as much. But we all know now, we're hearing, if we didn't know before, about the stop and frisk policy, where mostly black people were stopped by the police, arrested for no reason, had their lives ruined. We all know now about the case of the Central Park Five, the 5 teens who were convicted of rape, wrongfully convicted. And we know that Donald Trump took out a newspaper ad saying they should get the death penalty. But nobody talks about how, as mayor, Michael Bloomberg kept them from getting compensated once their convictions were vacated. They waited 12 years. They didn't get any compensation till after Bloomberg left office. So this is what we see. And he's a very wealthy man. So he can buy these quote unquote leaders, as we call them, the black misleadership class. These mayors and members of Congress are lining up to endorse him, despite his record. And it's very, now I don't know if the people though are going to follow them. That remains to be seen. But now he's a Democrat again, and he's got a lot of money, so he's seen as being someone who can win because of that. I'm not sure that's true. And in any case, saying constantly that Trump is the worst thing that could ever happen, we are now seeing people making, I believe, very bad decisions. And just as he ended up being worse than Giuliani, I think Bloomberg could be worse than Trump.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, let's return to history for a bit. Some of the things that really grabbed me in the book, you had a quote here that, well, I don't have the exact quote, but when talking about President Zachary Taylor, you drew a comparison between the unquestioned right that white Americans at the time had to steal land from the Native Americans and turn it into slave plantations. You contrasted that with the feelings of entitlement that drive the racism of today. And, I was hoping you could elaborate on that for us a bit.
Yeah, well, we often behave as though racism is just some kind of a mistake that can be gotten rid of with goodwill. But it's something that is deeply foundational. And when you have a president, and of the first 12 presidents, 10 were slaveholders. The only two who were not were the Adamses. And they became president because that is what one did in order to become wealthy. And so Taylor owned a huge plantation in Mississippi. He constantly complained, though. He had this huge plantation, owned many people, but he constantly whined and complained that he wasn't making enough money, and there was a flood, or there was a drought, and it became something of an issue at the time. But now if you have someone who does that, who makes a living, who rises politically, having done that, then you cannot question, and it's difficult to question racism itself. Imperialism, he's one of the presidents who helped to steal Mexico and to make Texas a state and to add to the slaveholding states. It's difficult for people all these decades later to change their country, to question whether the U.S. has a right to do certain things domestically and internationally. Do we have the right to have 2 million people in jail? Do we have the right to decide who runs Venezuela? Do we have, if you could, like Zachary Taylor helped steal Mexico, most of the Western United States was Mexico until the war in the late 1840s, then it's hard for people to question whether the United States has the right to invade Iraq. And all too often the answer can be yes, might makes right, and America's good, and it's something Americans have to stop thinking of themselves as good people and their leaders as good people. But that is an example of how our history and how the actions of these people determine what people believe today, to our detriment and to the detriment of the world.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, I have to tell you that and I'm not an expert, but I've read a fair amount of these books on alternative histories, like Howard Zinn's book and so forth. But, I learned something for the first time reading your book. I learned about a massacre that took place 120 miles from my childhood home, less than 30 years before I was born. I had never heard of it. And that's the massacre in Elaine, Arkansas. And, just really brought out to me how much we've sanitized our history.
Yes, in Elaine, Arkansas in 1919, that was a terrible couple of years. That was called the Red Summer. They were called race riots, but they were mob attacks on black people. And in this town of Elaine, black farmers had banded together to try to be treated better, to get better prices for their cotton. And in response, there rose up a mob against them. Many people were killed. It's not clear how many. Woodrow Wilson was president at the time. He did nothing about mob attacks in East St. Louis, Illinois, or in Elaine, Arkansas. And these attacks happened towards the end of the First World War and immediately afterwards. And they were not uncommon. These mob attacks against Black communities, the lynching of many individuals, was something that was a constant in U.S. history. And Wilson, of course, was one of the most openly racist presidents, an unreconstructed Southerner who screened Birth of a Nation in the White House. So he did not lift a finger in any of these incidents. And but you're right that I think Black people are more aware of these things, but these are not things that are taught. And I always think of that when we talk about atrocities committed around the world, and Americans like to judge and, do the Germans atone for the Holocaust? Does this one tell the truth in their history books? Well, do we tell the truth in ours? And the answer to that is no.
No.
I didn't have access to some top secret archive. Anyone who starts to research any of these people can get the same information. But too many biographers and scholars are interested in elevating these people and in so doing defending the system, not calling them or the system into account. So many of these things are disappeared.
No, and they don't really conform to our national myth of the great, people seeking freedom and justice for all. This just does not, this doesn't work with the myth at all. Unfortunately,
it doesn't. And the term that one has to use is white supremacy. And most people, I suppose it's a good thing that people don't want to think of themselves as white supremacists. Of course, there are people who own it, but this desire to want to be positive about your country is understandable. But I think we need to change what we're positive about. We don't have to, and we're talking on President's Day. This is President's Day month, and we can be proud of other people. We don't have to cover up. We don't have to omit. And omissions are lies. A misstatement of fact is not the only lie. If you just don't say that something happened, then you're also telling a lie. Right. So we don't have to keep doing this. But I think if people are confronted with this, then they also have to be confronted with the kind of country we have today and about actions as individuals. And I think that would be difficult, but nobody's going to die. They may act like they do. People complain about reverse racism or political correctness or anything.
Right.
But so what? And we need new heroes. You mentioned Howard Zinn, and if you read his books, or James Lowen's books, Lies My Teacher Told Me, then you find out about people we can all be proud of, people who are heroic.
Right. Well, and I want to point out for listeners that there is on YouTube actually a two-part documentary about the Elaine, Arkansas riots, which focuses really on the bravery and the skill of a Black lawyer in Little Rock at that time who risked his own life over and over again and finally got all of the people arrested, which of course were all Black people, out of jail. It's really quite worthwhile. Just search YouTube for Elaine Massacre. It'll come right up.
Yeah, and it's good to know these things. It's good to know that we were not always victims, and that there were always efforts at liberation. During the Civil War, it was the enslaved who made the war a war for slavery when they escaped constantly. Every time Union troops approached, they ran to the Union lines. And then it became there was no waffling. There was a war for slavery, and the U.S. colored troops who had to fight or be killed. They didn't even have the right to be taken prisoner and to be treated humanely. The struggles of people like that, and this attorney you mentioned, people struggled mightily, and they deserve to be elevated too. And we don't have to claim that we have to have this day to say good things about Zachary Taylor or anybody else.
No, we don't have to. But it's funny. Speaking of saying good things about people, I mean, you had one quote that I really liked when discussing Harry Truman, and you said that devotion to the idea of a savior had not abated since the days of Lincoln. And the disappointments and outright betrayals had not changed the hope for salvation from some political figure or party. And it does seem that we are always looking for a savior, particularly when we have a presidential election. That we dream that we will be able to elect someone who is going to take care of everything, and we can then relax.
Yeah, it's a way of actually making people docile. So first of all, we emphasize, and I'm not telling anybody not to vote, but we behave as though the only political activity you can take part in is voting. And it's really mass action, mostly peaceful mass action, that has changed the country. The civil rights movement, of course, followed, which inspired so many others. We have an EPA today because millions of people protested about the ecology, about the environment of the country. So it's not just voting, and we're told it's every election. This is the most important election ever. Now with Trump, of course, it's amplified even more. But there are things we can do. We don't have to be passive. You can critique the party you belong to. After Hillary Clinton lost, Democrats should have turned on the Democratic Party with anger. That they, after assuring them that there's no way Trump could win, that he did win. And so that can be a way of being politically active too. You don't just have to go along to get along. You have to ask hard questions and make demands and get involved in local, especially issues that really touch people's lives in a very direct way. So all of those things should be done in addition to voting.
Yes, I agree. And I find that, if criticisms of the Democratic Party, and particularly of candidates such as, for example, Bernie Sanders, in whom so many people are now seeing as the potential savior, that boy, anytime I make a criticism of them, I get dumped on pretty heavily. Because people really just are, it's like a cheerleading kind of thing, where it's like if you're not rooting for the team, it's
yeah, it's it is hard because we are so bereft of any good news, but by that I mean good quality reporting, and people want someone to save us, so so if you support someone, they're not just the person you support, they're like a deity to be worshipped almost. And because we are told so often that we don't have any options, and the attacks on Sanders are, well, somebody declares that he will lose. I don't know on what basis, especially after 2016, when we were assured Trump wouldn't win. I don't know why we're supposed to believe anybody who claims this or that person is more or less electable. But so we personalize instead of being savvy politically. And I think that's also due to the absence of political activity. We put all our hopes and love and dreams into frail human beings.
Mm-hmm. Well, and everything gets directed. I recall you're telling me in a previous interview that movements. I forget exactly what you said. It's something to the effect that the Democratic Party is where movements go to die.
Yes.
And that,
Yes.
it's quite true.
I stole that line from someone. I can't remember who, so I can't even tell you who it was.
It's a great line. I use it all the time.
Oh, good.
So, just to kind of wrap up here, I just wanted to ask you, like, in doing this book and in completing this book, are there lessons that you gained from this, and there insights that you gained from the process of doing this book and the reactions now that you've had to it?
So many lessons. It's I know you can't rely on the internet to do research. You've got to go to the library and read books. I know that much. And there is no end to the omissions, the lies of omission that we have been taught. And I think it's important for people to realize that. I also think it's important to not be afraid to be critical of one's country, and even of one's, it could end up being, one's family, or, the group you identify with.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to be brave in asserting the truth. And also people want to know the truth. There are people who are hungry for this, and they honor and respect finding out information that they have not been given before.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. Well, yeah, and I there's so much that we haven't been given in our history, and I think it's great that you've done this work, and particularly I admire that you have managed to go and find, like, the information about presidents that we barely know their names, the Chester Alan Arthurs and the
yes.
and the James Garfields of the world. You did manage to find out things about them, and give us some insight into what was going on.
Yeah, it was. So I was like, okay, so who the heck was Chester Arthur? But but it was interesting. Speaking of him, he, as an attorney, he argued for the freedom of enslaved people who had been brought to New York State.
Mm-hmm.
He argued on behalf of a black woman who was thrown off a trolley car. And but then, and he's not the only one. In order to once he became politically ambitious, he forgot all of that. And so when the Supreme Court threw out the Civil Rights Act of the Reconstruction era, he didn't do anything to try to pass new legislation,
right.
Despite the fact that he was a Republican, and black people were depending on him to save them. So we have people who may have started out being somewhat caring about justice, but the system ground them down, or they chose to make that deal with the devil and went along with the status quo.
Mm. Well, I hope that doesn't repeat, but it probably will.
Unless we fight.
We got to keep. Well, we got to keep fighting.
The pressure on.
We got to keep the pressure on. Exactly. Well, Margaret, I thank you very much for joining me, and I do hope we can get you out here to the West Coast to tell people about your book. I would love for that to happen. Well, take care, and thanks again for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Margaret Kimberley for joining me, and thanks to you for listening to Wider View.